I stand in the marble-floored law office, watching my son Brandon sneer at me while his wife Sarah smirks beside expensive leather chairs. Don't expect a dime from Mom's 52 million. Old man, Brandon says coldly. It's ours now. Sarah laughs, her voice sharp as glass. You should be grateful if we let you stay around. The words slice through me, like daggers. My beloved wife Margaret died 3 months ago, and now my own son treats me like garbage. Attorney Robert Thompson enters, carrying the will that will change everything forever. My name is Dallas, and at 67 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing here listening to my own flesh and blood speak to me like I'm some burden to be discarded. But to understand how we got to this moment, you need to know the real story of how Margaret and I built our fortune from absolutely nothing. It was 1982 when Margaret and I scraped together our last $3,000 to buy our first rental property in a rundown neighborhood in Austin, Texas. I was working construction, coming home every night with concrete dust in my hair and calluses on my hands that would crack and bleed. Margaret worked as a secretary at a small insurance company, making barely enough to cover our rent on a one-bedroom apartment that had more problems than solutions. That first property was a disaster. The roof leaked, the plumbing was from the 1940s, and the electrical system was held together with prayer and electrical tape. But Margaret saw something I couldn't. While I focused on the work that needed doing, she had this incredible vision for what it could become. We spent every weekend for 6 months renovating that house, living on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. Margaret kept meticulous records in spiral notebooks, tracking every penny we spent on materials, every hour we worked, every potential rental income calculation. She had this amazing instinct for numbers and people. While I could swing a hammer and lay tile, she could look at a neighborhood and predict which way property values would move in the next 5 years. We worked 16-hour days. I'd come home from my construction job, grab a quick dinner, and we'd head to the property to work until midnight. Margaret would be there with her notebook, making lists, calling suppliers, negotiating better prices on everything from paint to plumbing fixtures. She never complained, never said she was tired, never suggested we give up, even when things looked impossible. By 1984, we had 3 rental properties generating enough income for me to quit construction and focus on real estate full-time. Margaret had convinced her boss to let her work part-time so she could handle the business side of our operation. That's when she really showed her genius. She developed this system for evaluating properties that was years ahead of anything else in the market. The 1980s were boom times in Texas, but Margaret was smart enough to see the cycles coming. When oil prices crashed in '86 and everyone was panic selling, we bought 7 properties at below market prices. While other investors were running scared, Margaret was running spreadsheets, calculating exactly how long we could hold properties until the market turned around. By 1990, we owned 15 rental properties across Austin and San Antonio. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with just residential real estate. She'd been studying commercial properties, learning about retail spaces and office buildings. That's when she spotted an abandoned shopping center that the previous owner was desperate to unload after a major tenant defaulted. Everyone told us we were crazy to buy it. The place was falling apart, half the storefronts were empty, and it was in a part of town that most people avoided after dark. But Margaret had done her research. She knew the city was planning to build a new highway interchange that would bring traffic right past that shopping center. We spent 2 years and every penny we had renovating that place. I learned skills I never knew I had, from electrical work to commercial HVAC systems. Margaret negotiated with dozens of potential tenants, offering competitive rates to small businesses that needed affordable space to get started. She had this gift for seeing potential in people, the same way she saw potential in properties. The highway opened in 1993, and suddenly our shopping center was in the perfect location. We went from 50% occupancy to full within 6 months. The rental income from that one property was more than we'd made from all our residential properties combined. That's when I developed my earthquake-resistant building techniques. After seeing damage from the Northridge earthquake in California, I realized there was a market for construction methods that could protect buildings in disaster-prone areas. I spent 3 years perfecting a system using flexible steel reinforcement and shock-absorbing foundations that could keep buildings standing when everything around them collapsed. Margaret handled all the business negotiations for my construction patents. She was incredible at reading people, knowing exactly when to push for better terms and when to walk away from a deal. By the late 90s, we were licensing my building techniques to construction companies across the West Coast. and making royalty payments that provided steady income regardless of market fluctuations. We reinvested everything. While other successful couples were buying luxury cars and vacation homes, Margaret and I were buying more properties and expanding our business. By 2010, we owned 47 properties across Texas, California, and Arizona, plus the ongoing royalty income from my construction patents. But Brandon never understood any of this. He grew up wealthy, attending private schools and summer camps, never knowing what it felt like to eat ramen noodles for weeks because that's all you could afford. To him, money just appeared. When he wanted something, it was there. When he needed something, we provided it. I remember a conversation Margaret and I had just 2 years before she got sick. Brandon was 28 then, working at a marketing firm but spending more than he made and constantly asking us for money to cover his expenses. Margaret was worried. "He thinks money just appears, Dallas," she said one evening as we sat on our back porch, looking out over the lake behind our home. "He doesn't understand struggle. He doesn't understand what it means to build something with your own hands and sacrifice for it." I thought she was being too hard on him. "Hell, figure it out," I told her. "When he's ready to settle down and start a family, he'll understand responsibility." Margaret shook her head. "I'm not so sure. Every time we bail him out, we're teaching him that there are no real consequences for his choices. What happens when we're not here anymore?" Looking back now, I realize Margaret saw something in Brandon that I was too blind to see. While I still believed in the son I'd raised, she was already preparing for the son he'd actually become. The climactic twist that I didn't realize until much later was that Brandon had always believed our fortune came from Margaret's family, not from the decades of work Wed put in together. Had somehow convinced himself that Wed inherited money, that our success was just luck rather than the result of 30 years of sacrifice and smart decisions. That misunderstanding would shape everything that happened next. Margaret was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer in January of 2023. I'll never forget that day in Dr. Patterson's office when he delivered the news. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hand in mine, asking practical questions about treatment options and survival rates, while I felt like the world was collapsing around us. The diagnosis meant immediate and aggressive treatment. Chemotherapy every 2 weeks, radiation 5 days a week, surgical consultations, and a constant stream of doctor appointments. I took a leave of absence from managing our properties to become Margaret's full-time caregiver. We moved Margaret to our bedroom on the first floor of our house, converting the dining room into a medical station with all the equipment she needed. I learned to administer her medications, keep track of her treatment schedule, and help her with basic needs when the chemotherapy left her too weak to function normally. The treatments were brutal. Margaret, who had always been strong and independent, became frail and exhausted. There were days when she couldn't keep food down, nights when the pain kept her awake, and weeks when just getting dressed required tremendous effort. But through it all, she maintained her dignity and her concern for others. During those first 6 months of treatment, Brandon visited exactly once. He showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, stayed for 30 minutes, and spent most of that time on his phone taking business calls. When Margaret tried to tell him about her treatment progress, he interrupted to complain about problems at his job. "Mom, I'm really stressed about work right now," he said, not even looking at her as she lay in bed wearing the scarf that covered her hair loss. "My boss is being unreasonable about my sales targets, and Sarah thinks I should quit and find something better." Margaret nodded and smiled, trying to be supportive even while dealing with her own crisis. "Maybe this is an opportunity to figure out what you really want to do with your career," she suggested gently. Brandon's response was to check his watch. "I should probably get going. Sarah's expecting me home for dinner, and you know how she gets when I'm late." After he left, Margaret cried for the first time since her diagnosis. Not from physical pain, but from the heartbreak of watching her son treat her illness as an inconvenience in his schedule. I started calling Brandon regularly, trying to keep him informed about Margaret's condition and asking him to visit more often. His excuses were always the same. "I'm too busy with work," or "Sarah's stressed about her own stuff right now," or "hospitals just depress me, and I don't think it helps Mom to see me upset." The worst night was in August when Margaret had emergency surgery to remove a blood clot that had formed as a complication from her chemotherapy. The doctors told us it was life-threatening, and there was no guarantee she'd survive the operation. I called Brandon 16 times that night, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. "Brandon, your mother is in surgery. The doctors say it's serious. Please call me back. Brandon. It's Dad again. We're still waiting. Mom needs you here. Brandon, please pick up the phone. I don't know if your mother is going to make it through the night. He never answered. I found out later that he was in Las Vegas with Sarah, gambling at the poker tables, while his mother fought for her life in a hospital operating room. When he finally called me back 2 days later, his only comment was, well, she made it through, right? So everything worked out fine. Margaret survived the surgery, but her recovery was slow and painful. I slept in a chair beside her hospital bed for 12 days, holding her hand and talking to her even when she was unconscious. The nurses brought me blankets and tried to convince me to go home and get proper rest, but I couldn't leave her alone. When Margaret woke up after the surgery, the first thing she asked was, "Where's Brandon?" I had to tell her that he wasn't there. I watched her face crumple with disappointment, and I made excuses for him because I couldn't bear to see her hurt any more than she already was. Sarah's behavior was even worse than Brandon's. She refused to visit Margaret at all, claiming, "It's too depressing, and I might catch something." When I explained that cancer isn't contagious, she just shrugged and said, "I don't like being around sick people. It gives me anxiety." During Margaret's final 3 weeks, I never left her side. I slept in the hospital chair, ate cafeteria food, and watched her slowly slip away while holding her hand and telling her stories about our early years together. I wanted her to remember the good times, the excitement of building our business, the pride we felt when we achieved our dreams. Brandon showed up 2 days after Margaret died, not for the funeral planning, not to help with arrangements, not to comfort his grieving father. He came to ask about the will. "So, Dad, when do we meet with the lawyer?" he asked, still wearing his golf clothes because Head come directly from the country club. "Sarah and I have been talking, and we think it makes sense to get Mom's affairs settled as quickly as possible." I stared at him in disbelief. "Your mother has been dead for less than 48 hours, and you want to talk about money?" He had the audacity to look annoyed. "Dad, be practical. Mom was the one who handled all the financial stuff. We need to figure out what she left behind and how to manage it going forward." That conversation revealed something that shocked me to my core. The climactic twist I discovered during that visit was that Brandon had deliberately avoided being involved in Margaret's final days because He'd been consulting with lawyers about contesting any will that didn't favor him. He'd used the time of her illness to research inheritance law and establish legal distance from her death, planning to challenge her final wishes if they didn't meet his expectations. While I was caring for his dying mother, my son was planning how to steal her final gift to us both. In the weeks following Margaret's funeral, I started noticing things missing from our home. Small things at first, items I thought I might have misplaced in my grief. But when I went to collect Margaret's jewelry to store it safely, I realized that several valuable pieces were gone, including the diamond necklace I'd given her for our 25th anniversary. Something about Brandon's behavior during his brief visits didn't sit right with me. He seemed nervous, always checking his phone, and He'd ask strange questions about Margaret's business accounts and investment portfolios. When I mentioned the missing jewelry, he suggested that maybe Margaret had given those pieces to charity or sold them to pay for medical expenses. That explanation didn't make sense to me. Margaret had excellent health insurance, and all her medical bills were covered. But the seed of doubt Brandon planted made me start paying closer attention to other discrepancies I'd been too grief-stricken to notice before. I hired a private investigator named Jack Morrison, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes. What Jack uncovered over the next 3 weeks destroyed any remaining illusions I had about my son's character. Brandon had gambling debts totaling over $200,000. Had been making secret trips to Atlantic City for the past 2 years, staying at high-end casinos and betting far beyond his means at poker tables and blackjack games. Sarah wasn't just aware of his gambling addiction. She was actively encouraging it, convinced that one big win would solve all their financial problems. The investigation revealed credit cards I'd never seen before, opened in Brandon's name but using our home address. Had been intercepting the statements before I could see them, and when he couldn't make the minimum payments, Had started taking cash advances from other cards to cover the debt. But the worst discovery was still to come. Jack found evidence that Brandon had forged Margaret's signature on a $75,000 personal loan from our bank. Had used her medical condition as an excuse, telling the loan officer that the money was needed for experimental cancer treatments not covered by insurance. Bank security footage from the day the loan was processed showed Brandon using Margaret's debit card and personal identification to access her accounts while she was unconscious in the hospital. Had literally stolen money from his dying mother to feed his gambling addiction and pay for Sarah's shopping sprees. The investigation also revealed that Brandon had been searching through Margaret's home office during his rare visits. Had photographed financial documents, copied account numbers, and even installed a keylogger on Margaret's computer to capture her passwords and banking information. Margaret's trusted business partner, Linda Chen, confirmed my worst fears when I met with her to discuss our property management company. Linda had worked with Margaret for 15 years and knew her better than almost anyone. Dallas, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this, Linda said, her voice heavy with sadness. Margaret knew about Brandon's theft. She showed me the bank statements and security footage about 2 months before she died. My heart stopped. She knew? Why didn't she tell me? Linda reached across her desk and handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Margaret's handwriting. She said you had enough to worry about with her medical care. She didn't want to burden you with this until after she was gone, but she wanted you to know the truth. Inside the envelope was a letter from Margaret, along with copies of documents proving everything the private investigator had discovered. Her handwriting was shaky from the medication, but her message was clear. My dearest Dallas, by the time you read this, it'll be gone, and you'll be learning some difficult truths about our son. I've known about Brandon's gambling and stealing for months. I installed security cameras in our home office after money started disappearing from our accounts. I have video evidence of him searching through our files and copying financial information. The letter continued. I also know that he's been planning to challenge my will. His phone records show calls to 3 different inheritance lawyers during my final months. Has been researching ways to have you declared mentally incompetent so he can take control of our assets. I'm sorry you have to learn about this now, when you're already grieving, but you need to protect yourself. The final revelation in Margaret's letter was the most shocking of all. She had changed her will just 2 weeks before she died, and Shed left specific instructions with her attorney about how to handle Brandon's theft and betrayal. Shed also discovered that Sarah had been researching my life insurance policies on our home computer, calculating how much money they would receive if something happened to me after Margaret's death. The climactic twist that completely shattered my remaining faith in Brandon was that Margaret had uncovered evidence of his plan to have me declared mentally incompetent after her death, had been consulting with lawyers about guardianship laws, researching how adult children can gain control of elderly parents' assets, and preparing to claim that grief had left me incapable of managing our estate. My son wasn't just stealing from us while his mother was dying. He was planning to steal everything we'd built, including my freedom and independence, as soon as she was gone. The law offices of Thompson, Martinez and Associates occupied the entire 20th floor of a downtown Austin high-rise. Attorney Robert Thompson had been Margaret's lawyer for over 15 years, handling everything from property acquisitions to business contracts. The conference room where we gathered for the will reading had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city Margaret and I had helped build through our real estate investments. Brandon arrived, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit he'd never seen before, probably purchased with stolen money. Sarah wore a black designer dress and, to my horror, the diamond necklace that had belonged to Margaret, the one that had disappeared from our home. She was literally wearing stolen jewelry to claim her inheritance from the woman Shed robbed. Brandon was confident, almost cocky, as he settled into one of the leather chairs around the mahogany conference table. He kept checking his phone and making quiet comments to Sarah about their plans for the inheritance money. First thing we do is sell that big house, he whispered to Sarah, loud enough for me to hear. Too much maintenance for the old man to handle anyway. Well, put him in one of those nice senior communities and use the house money for the business investment we talked about. Sarah nodded, admiring the stolen necklace in her reflection on the conference table's polished surface. I already found a real estate agent. She thinks the house could sell for $4.2 million in this market. I sat quietly, still reeling from everything I'd learned about their betrayals, wondering how Margaret had managed to stay strong while knowing the truth about our son's character. Attorney Thompson entered the conference room carrying a thick manila folder and a sealed envelope. His expression was somber, more serious than I'd ever seen him in all our years of working together. Before we begin, Thompson said, settling into his chair at the head of the table, I need to remind everyone that this is a formal, legal proceeding. The will I'm about to read was executed by Margaret Rose Dallas on February 14th, 2023, just 2 weeks before her death. She was of sound mind and body when she signed these documents, and they were witnessed by 2 independent parties who had no financial interest in her estate. Brandon interrupted impatiently. Let's cut to the chase, Mr. Thompson. How much do I get, and when can we start transferring assets? Thompson's jaw tightened slightly at Brandon's callous tone. Mr. Dallas, I strongly advise you to listen carefully to your mother's complete will before making any assumptions about your inheritance. Sarah leaned forward eagerly, her eyes bright with greed. Is there anything complicated about the distribution? We're assuming everything goes to Brandon as the only child, with maybe a small allowance for Dallas until he passes away. I felt my hands trembling as Thompson broke the seal on the envelope containing Margaret's will. Even though her letter had prepared me for some of what was coming, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear her final words read aloud in front of the son who had betrayed us both. Thompson cleared his throat and began reading in a clear, professional voice. I, Margaret Rose Dallas, being of sound mind and body, leave my entire estate, valued at approximately $52 million, to my beloved husband, Dallas, Michael Dallas, with specific instructions regarding our son Brandon's inheritance. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Complete silence filled the conference room as the meaning of that first sentence sank in. Brandon's face went white as printer paper. Sarah's mouth fell open, and she unconsciously reached up to touch the stolen necklace around her neck. That's impossible, Brandon shouted, jumping to his feet. She promised me everything. We had conversations about this. She told me the business would be mine someday. Thompson remained calm, his voice steady. Mr. Dallas, please sit down. There are specific provisions in your mother's will that address your concerns, but I need to read the complete document before answering any questions. Sarah grabbed Brandon's arm, her voice shrill with panic. This has to be a mistake. She was on medication. She wasn't thinking clearly. I can assure you, Thompson replied firmly, that Mrs. Dallas was completely lucid when she executed this will. She had 2 independent mental health evaluations performed before signing, specifically to prevent any challenges based on mental capacity. Brandon slumped back into his chair, his confidence completely shattered. The climactic twist that stopped the room cold was not just that Margaret had left everything to me, but Thompson's indication that there were very specific conditions and revelations about Brandon that were still to be revealed. The worst was yet to come. Attorney Thompson continued reading Margaret's will, his voice growing more serious with each revelation. My decision to leave the bulk of my estate to my husband, rather than my son, is based on documented evidence of financial irresponsibility, theft, and abandonment during my final illness. Brandon's hands were shaking now, and Sarah had gone completely silent, all her earlier arrogance replaced by visible fear. Specifically, Thompson continued, I am aware that my son Brandon has stolen approximately $75,000 from my personal accounts through forged signatures and unauthorized access to my banking information. I have video evidence of him searching through my private financial documents and copying sensitive information without my permission. Thompson paused to remove several photographs from the manila folder. These security camera images show Brandon using his mother's debit card and identification while she was unconscious in the hospital, accessing funds to pay gambling debts that totaled over $200,000 at the time of my death. The photos were devastating. Clear images of Brandon at the bank, using Margaret's card, forging her signature, and accessing accounts he had no legal right to touch. Sarah stared at the evidence in horror, realizing that her husband was not just a thief but a clumsy one who'd been caught red-handed. Furthermore, Thompson read, I am heartbroken to document that my son visited me only once during my 18-month battle with cancer, abandoning me during the most difficult period of my life. When I underwent emergency surgery that nearly resulted in my death, Brandon was gambling in Las Vegas and could not be reached despite 16 phone calls from his father. Brandon's face was red with shame and anger. She's making it sound worse than it was. I had work obligations. I had my own life to manage. Thompson held up his hand for silence. Your mother's will includes a personal letter that addresses your behavior directly. She wrote, My son has shown me that he values money more than family, gambling more than responsibility, and personal pleasure more than the woman who gave him life. His wife Sarah has encouraged these destructive behaviors and shown nothing but contempt for our family during my illness. Sarah finally spoke, her voice desperate and pleading. She was sick. People say things when they're sick. This isn't fair. Mrs. Dallas was very specific about your role in this situation, Thompson replied, consulting the will again. She wrote, Sarah has demonstrated manipulative behavior designed to isolate Brandon from his family while encouraging his gambling addiction. She has shown no respect for my illness refusing to visit or offer support, while researching my husband's life insurance policies on our computer for her own financial benefit. The revelation about the life insurance research hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been clever, using our computer to look up policy information while Brandon distracted me during their visits. Margaret had known all along. Thompson continued with the specific provisions of the will. Brandon Dallas will receive $50,000 from his mother's estate, conditional upon his completion of 1 full year of professional gambling addiction treatment through a licensed rehabilitation program. Proof of attendance and successful completion must be provided to this law firm before any funds are released. $50,000, Brandon screamed. Out of $52 million? That's less than 1%. Your mother felt that giving you access to significant money while you struggle with gambling addiction would be enabling your destructive behavior, Thompson explained. She wanted to help you get your life together, not fund your continued self-destruction. The will continued, with even more devastating revelations. Sarah receives nothing from my estate, as she has shown herself to be a manipulative influence who encouraged my son's worst behaviors while showing contempt for my family during my time of greatest need. Sarah's face went through a range of emotions, from shock to anger to desperate calculation. I could see her mentally planning her exit strategy from a marriage that was no longer financially beneficial to her. Additionally, Thompson read, I am establishing the Margaret Rose Dallas Foundation for Cancer Research with $20 million from my estate. This foundation will fund innovative treatments and support families dealing with the financial burden of cancer care. My husband Dallas will serve as the foundation's president, with full authority to direct its charitable activities. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt something other than grief. The idea that her suffering would lead to help for other families facing the same battle gave meaning to the pain we'd endured together. Thompson wasn't finished. The remaining $32 million goes to my beloved husband Dallas, with specific instructions. Margaret wrote, Dallas, you have sacrificed so much for our family and for me during my illness. You deserve to live fully and find happiness again. Use this money to create the life you want. Travel to the places we dreamed of visiting. And don't spend your remaining years taking care of people who have shown you nothing but disrespect and ingratitude. Brandon was now frantically searching through his phone, probably calling the lawyer's head, consulted about contesting the will. But Thompson had more devastating news to deliver. Finally, this will include a restraining order that prevents Brandon from challenging any of these provisions based on documented evidence of theft. Any attempt to contest this will would result in criminal charges being filed for the money stolen during Mrs. Dallas' illness. The climactic twist that completely destroyed any remaining fight in Brandon was Thompson's final revelation. Mrs. Dallas also left evidence that Brandon had consulted with lawyers about having his father declared mentally incompetent to gain control of his assets after her death. Phone records and email communications document his plan to steal not just his inheritance, but his father's freedom and independence as well. Sarah immediately stood up and walked toward the door. I'm not staying for this, she announced. Brandon, figure out your own legal problems. I'm calling my lawyer about a divorce. And, with that, she was gone, taking Margaret's stolen necklace with her, and leaving Brandon to face the consequences of his actions alone. The aftermath of the will reading brought swift and devastating consequences for Brandon and Sarah. Within 72 hours, Sarah had filed for divorce, claiming she'd been unaware of Brandon's gambling addiction and financial crimes. She hired an aggressive attorney who immediately moved to freeze Brandon's assets and claim half of everything he owned, which wasn't much once his debts were calculated. Brandon's threats to contest Margaret's will collapsed when Thompson presented him with a detailed file of evidence documenting his theft. The FBI opened an investigation based on Margaret's documentation of forged signatures and unauthorized access to bank accounts. Federal charges for bank fraud were now hanging over Brandon's head like a sword. The gambling debts that Brandon had thought he could hide became public knowledge when his creditors started calling me directly, assuming I would pay his obligations now that Margaret was gone. Some of these men were not the type to accept late payments gracefully, and Brandon found himself receiving threats from people who collected debts through intimidation and violence. Sarah's divorce proceedings moved with remarkable speed once her attorney saw the evidence of Brandon's criminal activity. She wanted to distance herself from him as quickly as possible, before his legal troubles could affect her own financial future. The irony was brutal. The woman who had encouraged his gambling addiction and helped steal from his dying mother was now claiming to be his victim. Brandon's employer, a prestigious marketing firm in downtown Austin, fired him when news of the theft charges became public. Corporate clients didn't want to work with someone facing federal fraud charges, and the company couldn't afford the negative publicity. In a matter of weeks, Brandon went from a well-paid professional to an unemployed defendant with mounting legal bills. The local newspaper picked up the story after court documents became public record. The headline read, "Business Empire Founder Protects Legacy from Gambling Son." The article detailed how Margaret and I had built our fortune from nothing, and how Brandon had betrayed his family during his mother's final illness. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive of me and harshly critical of Brandon's behavior. Friends and neighbors who had known Margaret rallied around me with casseroles, visits, and offers to help with whatever I needed. The contrast between their genuine concern and my son's abandonment during Margaret's illness became even more stark. These people, some of whom barely knew us, showed more care and compassion than my own child had during the worst time of my life. Sarah's attempts to salvage something from the wreckage were pathetic to watch. After the divorce papers were filed, she called me repeatedly, claiming she'd been manipulated by Brandon and didn't understand how serious his problems were. She wanted to return the stolen jewelry and somehow repair our relationship, obviously hoping I might still provide financial support, even though Margaret's will had explicitly excluded her. I refused to take her calls or meet with her. Margaret had seen through Sarah's manipulation from the beginning, and her final letter had warned me not to be fooled by false remorse after the money was gone. Sarah eventually moved back to her hometown in Oklahoma, where she quickly began dating a recently divorced oil executive with more money than sense. Brandon hit rock bottom faster than I thought possible. With no job, no wife, mounting legal bills, and dangerous creditors demanding payment, he lost his expensive apartment and had to move into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. His fancy car was repossessed when he couldn't make the payments, and his country club membership was terminated for non-payment of dues. I felt no satisfaction watching my son's life collapse. Despite everything Head done, despite the pain Head caused Margaret and me, I couldn't find any joy in his suffering. If anything, I felt profound sadness that the little boy Id raised, the child Id taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework, had become someone capable of such cruelty and selfishness. The Margaret Rose Dallas Foundation became operational 6 months after her death, and our first grant went to a research team developing new immunotherapy treatments for breast cancer. When I attended the press conference announcing the funding, I met Dr. Patricia Williams, whose pioneering work had the potential to save thousands of lives. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt like something good was coming from our tragedy. But the most unexpected moment came 9 months after the will reading, when I received a phone call that changed everything once again. It was Brandon, calling from the county jail where he was being held on theft charges. His voice was different, broken in a way I'd never heard before. "Dad," he said, barely above a whisper, "I need help. Not money, not lawyers, not someone to bail me out of the mess I made. I need help becoming the person Mom thought I could be, instead of the person I turned into." The climactic twist that caught me completely off guard was that, despite everything Brandon had done, despite all the pain and betrayal and theft, my heart still broke for the lost soul my son had become. Margaret's final instructions had included one last provision I hadn't mentioned to anyone. If Brandon ever truly sought redemption, I was supposed to give him one final chance at becoming the man Shed always hoped he could be. 6 months after that phone call from jail, I found myself sitting in a family therapy session with Brandon, having one of the most honest conversations we'd had in years. He had successfully completed 4 months of intensive gambling addiction counseling, attending meetings every day, and working with a sponsor who didn't tolerate excuses or self-pity. The changes in Brandon were remarkable. Gone was the entitled, arrogant man who had dismissed his mother's suffering. In his place was someone who had finally begun to understand the depth of pain Head caused and the work required to earn redemption. His voice carried genuine remorse when he spoke about Margaret, and for the first time since childhood, I could see traces of the decent person I'd always hoped he could become. "I read Mom's letter to you," he told me during one of our sessions. "The therapist thought it would help me understand how my actions affected other people. Dad, I had no idea how much I hurt her. I was so focused on my own problems, my own wants, that I completely lost sight of what was happening to the most important person in my life." The family therapist, Dr. Robert Martinez, had warned me that Brandon's recovery would be a long process, with no guarantees of success. Many gambling addicts relapse multiple times before achieving lasting sobriety, And the damage Brandon had done to our family couldn't be undone simply by completing a treatment program, but Margaret's will had been wise in its structure. The $50,000 inheritance was contingent on 1 full year of treatment. Not just attendance, but genuine progress, measured by counselors who specialized in addiction recovery. Brandon understood that this money wasn't a reward for past behavior, but seed money for a different future if he could prove Head truly changed. The most difficult part of Brandon's recovery was accepting responsibility for the pain Head caused Margaret during her final months. During our family sessions, he had to confront the fact that his mother died believing her son cared more about money than her life. That knowledge broke something inside him that needed to be broken before healing could begin. Brandon found work with a construction company, starting at the bottom and learning the value of honest physical labor for the first time in his adult life. The man who had once worn expensive suits to marketing meetings was now coming home, covered in concrete dust, and proud of a full day's work. It reminded me of my own early years, and I began to see glimpses of the work ethic Margaret and I had tried to instill in him as a child. Sarah's divorce was finalized during Brandon's 6th month of treatment. She had moved to Oklahoma and married her oil executive, apparently finding the financial security shed always prioritized over genuine love or loyalty. Brandon signed the papers without protest, acknowledging that their relationship had been built on enabling each other's worst behaviors, rather than supporting each other's growth. The Margaret Rose Dallas Foundation celebrated its first major success during Brandon's recovery period. The research team WED-funded announced a breakthrough in immunotherapy treatment that showed remarkable results in early trials. Dr. Williams called to tell me that our funding had helped save the life of their first patient, a 34-year-old mother of 3 who had been given only months to live. Standing in the hospital room, meeting that woman and her family, I finally understood what Margaret had meant in her final letter about using our money to create meaning rather than just accumulating wealth. Our foundation wasn't just honoring Margaret's memory. It was turning her suffering into hope for other families facing the same battle. During Brandon's recovery, I also began dating again. Helen Patterson had been Margaret's oncology nurse during her final months, and she had shown incredible kindness to both of us during that difficult time. When Helen asked me to dinner 6 months after Margaret's death, I almost said no, out of loyalty to my wife's memory. But Margaret's letter had been clear about this too. Dallas, you have so much love to give, and you deserve to receive love in return. Don't spend your remaining years alone out of misplaced guilt. I want you to be happy, to travel, to laugh again, to build new relationships with people who appreciate the wonderful man you are. Helen understood grief in ways most people couldn't, having watched hundreds of families navigate loss and healing. She never tried to replace Margaret or compete with her memory. Instead, she helped me learn how to honor my wife's legacy while still embracing the possibility of new happiness. Brandon's transformation became complete when he decided to become an addiction counselor himself. After completing his year of treatment and receiving his inheritance, he used the money to pay for education and certification, rather than trying to gamble his way back to wealth. He wanted to help other people avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed his life and family. Our family gatherings resumed slowly and carefully. Quiet dinners, where we shared memories of Margaret, talked about the foundation's work, and slowly rebuilt trust that had been completely shattered. Brandon brought flowers to Margaret's grave every week, a ritual that started as part of his recovery program, but continued because he needed that connection to the mother had failed during her lifetime. The legal consequences of Brandon's theft were resolved through a plea agreement that required full restitution and community service rather than prison time. He paid back every penny had stolen, plus interest, and spent 2 years volunteering at a nonprofit that helped families dealing with medical bankruptcies. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that he was now helping people facing the same kind of financial stress had created for his own family. 1 year after completing his treatment program, Brandon achieved a milestone that would have seemed impossible during the dark days after Margaret's death. He celebrated 1 full year of sobriety from gambling, had steady employment, was building a career helping other addicts, and had begun the long process of earning back his father's trust and respect. The life lesson that emerged from our family's journey through pain and redemption was profound. Sometimes, the greatest love means setting the hardest boundaries, and the strongest families are forged through forgiveness rather than entitlement. Margaret's final gift wasn't just financial security for my future. It was the wisdom to protect our family's values, while still leaving room for redemption if Brandon could prove he deserved it. Looking back now, I understand that Margaret's will wasn't just about money or justice. It was about teaching all of us what really matters in life. Family loyalty can't be purchased with inheritance promises. Love isn't demonstrated through enabling destructive behavior. And real wealth isn't measured in bank account balances, but in the positive impact we have on other people's lives. Today, the Margaret Rose Dallas Foundation has funded research that's helping cancer patients around the world. Brandon has helped over 200 people begin recovery from gambling addiction. Helen and I have traveled to places Margaret and I dreamed of visiting, carrying her memory with us while building new experiences together. The $52 million that caused so much pain and conflict became the foundation for healing, growth, and genuine service to others. Margaret's final lesson was that money is just a tool, and its value depends entirely on how we choose to use it. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with someone you love to protect them from their own destructive behavior? How did you find the courage to show tough love when enabling would have been easier? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about the balance between compassion and accountability in family relationships. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own family challenges, please like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear Margaret's message about the difference between loving someone and enabling their worst behaviors. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about real families navigating difficult choices and finding their way back to what truly matters. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me, and I hope Margaret's wisdom helps you build stronger, healthier relationships with the people you love most. Remember, the greatest inheritance we can leave our children isn't money, but the values and character that help them build meaningful lives.